Hello and welcome. Coming up tonight, is Donald Trump serious when saying he wants Palestinians to permanently leave Gaza? I'll ask his former aide, Anthony the Mooch Scaramucci, how much poorer will Trump's tariffs make us? Economics maestro Andy Haldane has the grim answer. Now, deep screening and Anushka will show you why artificial general intelligence is so powerful.
And I'll also be asking, do the public want Keir Starmer to be standing up or cozying up to Donald Trump?
And throughout the show, two politicians who always call a spade and a Trump and would never recant, even if sent to Washington to be our swanky ambassador. I'm talking about Labour's Emily Thornberry and the Tory Steve Baker. Watcher, now it may no longer shock that Donald Trump says and does stuff that no one alive could rationally have expected of the leader of what we used to call the free world. But the numbing doesn't make it easier to work out his motives or his intentions. Take his announcement that he wants to own Gaza, evict hundreds of thousands of its traumatised Palestinian citizens and build some kind of coastal resort that would be a hybrid of Dubai and Atlantic City. The point is that for all he was feted at the lectern by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and hailed as almost the Messiah by Israel's far right, there's no chance of any of that actually happening. The most powerful player in the region, Saudi Arabia, has lampooned his posturing, even though Trump and the Saudi leader, MBS, are supposedly best buds, and the neighbouring powers of Egypt and Jordan will never agree to engage in a forced migration that would look like a brutal and inhumane ethnic cleansing. Worse still, the risk of Trump's reckless démarche is that the ceasefire will rupture, more Palestinians will die, and the misery of Israeli hostages still in Gaza will be compounded. He can't want that, so what does he actually want? Those tariffs he threatened to impose on Canada and Mexico always looked like a device to force their leaders, Trudeau and Claudia Sheinbaum, to bow down before him and promise to guard the border better, which they did. As for the Chinese tariffs and Beijing's retaliation, that's two mafia bosses eyeballing each other but standing back from mutually assured destruction. But who does Trump seek to impress by uniting Arab and European leaders in condemnation of his attempt to bury any residual hope of a self-determining Palestinian state and therefore long-term secure peace in the region? Normally, I can see some kind of method in his seeming madness. Anushka, tonight I'm struggling.
I want to start by showing you what this war has done to Gaza. Academics used satellite images to calculate the percentage of buildings damaged or totally destroyed. Just look how quickly that damage stacked up to 60% of buildings across the whole Gaza Strip and actually 74% in Gaza City. Now, Donald Trump has suggested that Gaza's Arab neighbours, Jordan and Egypt, should be taking in Palestinians. They think otherwise. And it's worth saying there are already 6.5 million Palestinians living in Arab countries, including well over 2 million in Jordan who are refugees. Now, Keir Starmer made clear Britain's support for a two-state solution today, distancing himself from the president, but not condemning Trump. Is he being tough enough on the American president? I want to show you some polling that underlines his predicament, if you like. It was done before today by More in Common, but it shows that if people are asked which should the PM prioritise, working with Trump or standing up to him, the biggest number, 44%, want us cozying up. But actually quite a lot, 37%, do want to see a tougher stance from Keir Starmer. Now, it won't surprise you that there is a political divide on this. The Greens and the Lib Dems want a bit more critique. Labour voters and Conservatives are more split on this, although leaning towards America. But look at reform. 71% say prioritise that US relationship.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff, Anushka. I just want to start by talking to you, Emily, wearing your grand hats, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. But you could either answer in that capacity or just as a human being. How did you feel when you saw what Trump had to say overnight?
Well, I thought it was wrong, I thought it was illegal, and I didn't think it was going to work. So that was my first reaction. And then my next reaction is, what does he mean? Because you don't know. Because because he does have this philosophy of, say lots and lots of things, just confuse people, put out loads of messages at the same time. He also has a philosophy sometimes of punch someone hard on the nose, and because they thought they had a plan until that happened. There's a bit of that. Sometimes it's the first thing that's come into his head. And then I looked at what Netanyahu had to say. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought you said that it was welcomed by Netanyahu. It wasn't. What he did was really interesting, because Netanyahu, remember, has never said that he has any plan or any idea of what's going to happen next in Gaza, right? So we've got the American president coming out with, frankly, a unworkable, illegal and unfair scheme. And he just simply says, well, that's very interesting. And the president will be speaking to his aides about that. But he doesn't say, whatever, remarkable or whatever. But he didn't say, I agree with it. And he didn't say, we've been talking about it for the last 2 hours. So at this point, I started thinking, actually, I think this has just come off the top of his head. And it isn't necessarily something that he's serious about. But what he does want is he wants there to be a future in Gaza. And so I think the challenge for us is to stop putting the Middle East into a drawer which is too hard, can't be bothered, can't do it, and actually step up and start looking at how we're going to ensure that there is peace in the Middle East. And the only way there's going to be peace in the Middle East is for there to be a Palestinian state. And so we have to start working on that. And if it means, working with Saudi Arabia or other allies and saying, let's put something together and let's put it before Trump and say, we need you to use your close relationship with the Israelis to explain to them this is the only way forward and this is the only way you're going to be safe and secure, is for there to be peace, and for there peace has to be a Palestinian state, and your neighbours will guarantee your security and there will be a number of things involved. But you need to push the Israelis over the line on that. That is how we can move forward. And if he does want to have peace in the Middle East, which, on the face of it, he does, and it has to be explained to him, you can't forcibly move a whole population from one area somewhere else. It's just not going to work. It's illegal and it's unfair. But let's find a future and let's make sure that we work together in order to do it. Now, he has a certain strength. He has a certain resolution. If this can become his idea, he might have more strength and more resolution to deal with this than a dozen Democrat and Republican presidents who've gone before him who have palpably failed. So this is the challenge. If he wants a peace deal, if he wants a
okay, you're giving me the benefit of the doubt. Steve, I want to ask, I've got to go to Steve, actually, and simply, Steve. Just as an observer of a whole array of different politicians, what do you think he was trying to do here?
I think he was trying to be absolutely outrageous and take a wrecking ball to all norms of international diplomacy.
But why in this case?
Well, I think it's because he's trying to force the conversation. Insofar as there's any method to apparent madness, it has forced the conversation in there. I think it is worth just stepping back and thinking back a few months. There was a time when this looked like a potential path to World War III with Iran and Russia coming in. It could have been a disaster. And we do tend to forget Israel and Palestine between these eruptions of violence. That plainly can't go on any longer. So perhaps, in his usual wrecking ball style, he's tried to create the space whereby, behind the scenes, his diplomats can say to Jordan and Saudi and everybody else, well, what do you want to do instead? Because at the moment, the prospect of a two-state solution is rapidly diminishing, and that can't be right. It can't be in anyone's interests to allow this situation to go on as it has been.
And Emily, just very briefly, some of your colleagues have written a letter to David Lammy. I think, from what you've just said, you would agree with them that this looks like ethnic cleansing.
Oh. Well, I mean, if it was to go ahead, of course. But it's not going to go ahead.
Sure.
So that's the point. I'm just trying to be pragmatic. I always think what you have to do is measure everything in the Middle East against, are you increasing the chances of peace? So how do you go about pushing that forward? And the only way I think that one can turn this into any sort of positive is to say, right, Donald Trump, you want to look to the future. Here is a future.
Well, if it's increased the chances of peace by uniting almost everybody else in the world against him, then, maybe, as you say, there is that sort of weird method in what he's trying to do. Now, it won't surprise you that my next conversation was all about what Trump thought he was doing overnight. I spoke with Anthony the Mooch Scaramucci. He is the former Director of Communications for Donald Trump. He worked for him actually, it was only for a few days in his first term. It was a very volatile relationship. Now, I began by asking Anthony Scaramucci whether he believes that the president is being serious when, announcing, as I've just said, what sounds to many people like the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza.
I think he is serious, yes. I mean, the question is it executable? Is it something that's going to happen? I think the answer to that is no. But if you said to me, left to his own devices, unshackled by a Congress, unshackled by alliances and agreements, the United Nations, dealing with the Gulf, the community in the Gulf, would he want to do something like that? I think he would. And I think you have to know that.
I mean, there's normally some kind of method underneath what some people would call the madness. What is his game here?
Well, there may not be a method behind the madness. It may be as simplistic as what is going to give me the highest impact level of attention. He could be just somebody that's addicted to attention, to make an announcement about tariffs, give some of his friends an opportunity to trade that market and then pull the tariffs back. That's maybe what it is. I think we overanalyze him. He could have been in an ante room with Bibi Netanyahu, and Bibi Netanyahu has a right-leaning faction as part of his coalition that he needs to keep with him. And this was air cover for Bibi Netanyahu, for somebody like him to say that. I think the one thing that I was a little shocked by in the whole episode is the reaction from Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think it's...
In what sense?
I watched the body language between the two of them during that, and some people are saying that Netanyahu was super happy about that. I didn't see that. I saw a person frozen like a deer in the headlights, not knowing which way to turn in a situation like that.
Yeah, fascinating. If, which many people fear, we see a resumption of violence in the Middle East as a result of this, he won't take responsibility, will he?
Well, the very opposite. He'll blame everybody but himself. He's the perfect anti-executive. A good executive accepts responsibility for their subordinates and sort of deflects blame off of them. And when things are going well, gives credit to their subordinates. That's a good executive and it's a good sign of leadership. He's the opposite of that. He's the anti-executive.
Now, just on tariffs, we saw the threat of big tariffs on Canada and Mexico. They then came to the table, and some would say they're just re-announcing stuff they were already doing, but said they're going to put troops on the border and try and crack down on the fentanyl trade, and therefore the tariffs have been delayed for at least a month. However, it seems now that he's not going to be speaking to President Xi, and therefore this tariff war with China looks as though it's going to go ahead. Is this a new era, do you think, of Trump-led tariff trade war?
Yes, I mean, it's going to be more aggressive than the last era. And the great irony is that the agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was reset by Donald Trump and his team during the first Trump administration. So the irony there is he got it to where he wanted it to be. And so now just unilaterally suggesting those tariffs, I think, was nonsensical. It was going to really hurt the U.S. stock market. Everyone thinks Donald Trump is playing 4D chess, but I think he's sitting at the table eating the pieces. I mean, he's not doing anything that's sensical, and nobody around him is willing to check him.
So will we see tariffs imposed on the European Union, do you think? I mean, his language is very strong.
He wants to demean European leadership. If you're in his field of vision, he wants to demean you. When I talk to European leaders or members of parliament here, get out of his field of vision. To the extent that you can, use your aides and staff to work with members of the American government that are not Donald Trump. Because if you're in his field of vision, he's a sort of a very sad, angry guy, and he'll want to do things to you that are denigrating and demeaning. And so there's no sense of getting in his field of vision and engaging him.
So there'll be much more from Anthony Scaramucci right at the end of the programme, because I really wanted to broaden the conversation out to really encompass the relationship between the President, Elon Musk, President, and Keir Starmer. So do stick around for more of that. It's absolutely gripping. But with Emily and Steve, there's a couple of things I want to pick up. One of the issues that I think has been slightly underreported today was what Trump said about the West Bank. Right now, unlike Gaza, there are lots of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and there's a huge movement within Israel, particularly on the far right, to say that the West Bank, which is, let's be clear, in law is Palestinian territory, should be seized, expropriated by the state of Israel. Both of you, really, how anxious are you? Well, actually, what's going on today is he is paving the way for Israel to annex the West Bank.
Well, he may well be. I mean, I do recall that he moved the embassy to Jerusalem. I think he did actually follow through and do it. Yeah. But that's a real problem for a two-state solution that involves the West Bank.
It's fatal to a two-state solution.
It's fatal to a two-state solution. So if he's doing other than opening the door to Israel annexing the entire territory, it's difficult to see what that alternative is. Maybe he wants to create the space for a viable Palestine to be created, I don't know, in Sinai by doing some kind of deal with Egypt, but there's no sign of that being possible. So maybe he's trying to force that conversation, but it is extremely worrying because the Palestinian people are going to continue to commit atrocities if a two-state solution is taken off the table.
And Emily, one of the first things that Trump did, actually, on becoming president, was to rescind those sanctions on, some of the more extreme
violent settlers, yeah. So it seems as though he puts pressure on the Israelis to ensure that there's a peace in Gaza, but then the very next day, it moves on to the West Bank. And we've seen what's happened in Jenin and so on. And so the attention of the Israeli government is now on there. And that's obviously very concerning because nobody knows whether there's some kind of quiet agreement or understanding that that's now acceptable for the Israelis to spend some time sorting out the terrorists on the West Bank. And so it goes on, because we know that the coalition includes many people who quite openly say that the Israelis need to annex the West Bank. You can't annex the West Bank if you're going to have a two-state solution.
Yeah, no, as you say, deeply troubling. We're going to come back to this later in the programme. We are going to move on a little bit now. Anushka, share with us some numbers.
Yeah, you talked about Trump's tariffs, so I wanted to show you this chart from the Resolution Foundation. It plots countries depending on whether the US has a trade deficit with them or a trade surplus. So on this side, the surplus, the countries that the US sells more to than it buys. But in this direction, the US buys more from the countries than it sells to them, up to this massive US trade deficit with China, which makes Donald Trump mad. He says trade deficits are like the US handing out massive subsidies. Now, we know Donald Trump has so far targeted China and Mexico and Canada. Now, that additional 10% tariff on China will hit a lot of goods because it's out here. But the height of this shows countries how much of their trade is with the US. So actually, China isn't that dependent on those sales to America. Mexico and Canada, however, much higher up, they are really dependent on it. Now, Trump has paused plans for big tariffs on both of them. If he unpauses them, you can see from that position that it will be very painful for them. Now, here is the good news. We are over here, the UK, so we could slip under the radar. These are US figures. They suggest a trade surplus with the UK. Actually, our own data says otherwise, but don't tell President Trump that. And look, we're quite low, so we're not that exposed on the trade of goods. Now, we can hide over here, but Trump is very interested in the EU with deficits that you can see here with Germany, Italy, France, Ireland. Now, that poses a bit of a dilemma for Keir Starmer. If the EU and the US get locked into a trade war, which way should we look? Should we be closer to the US or to Europe? Now, earlier, I showed you that people think we should try to work with Trump over shouting at him. But interestingly, when asked this question by King's College London, if you had to choose between the US and Europe, it looks quite different. 53% say Europe. Although, interestingly, back in 1967, just before we joined the European community, the opposite was true. A majority said the US.
That's Anushka. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by former Bank of England chief economist Andy Haldane. I mean, Andy, just on the position of the UK and the US, historically, actually, we always had a deficit with the EU, and we always actually had a surplus with the US, especially in services. It's, as Anushka says, we slightly hope that Donald Trump hasn't noticed that. But do you think this is what you might call a new era of mercantilism, of tariffs, of trade wars?
I think the risk is there, Robert. I actually think and hope, though, that such is the act of self-harm, including to the US, that a lot of this is bargaining and will not come to.
Do you think Donald Trump understands, that were he to do everything he's threatening, that the living standards of millions of Americans would be squeezed?
Not fully. I mean, let's take an example. Car manufacture in the US.
Sorry?
Manufacturing cars in the US.
Yep.
To manufacture a car in the US, you have to import parts both north and south of the border, perhaps 7 of them. Imagine 25% tariffs on each and every one of those. That would raise the price of cars for US consumers through the roof. I think once that penny drops, the chances of this happening, I hope, are limited.
And can I just check on a sort of point of basic economics? The Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman says, actually, the deficits show that the world simply respects the power and might of the American economy, that there's a chicken and egg thing. He says the reason the deficit's there is because people lend so much effectively to America that they've just got the money to spend the money however they want. And Trump should regard this as a good thing.
Well, certainly, there's merit in that view, that actually the US, as a reserve currency, is a natural repository of people's savings. And were that to be lost, that would be a worse thing still from a Trump perspective, I'd say.
And then, just before we go to the break, more to talk about after the break, if he were to impose tariffs on the UK, economically, might answer politically, is the right thing to do to retaliate with tariffs of our own or just to stick to our free trade principles?
Well, I'd be inclined to stick rather than twist in that situation. It feels
and not
like
impose tariffs on America.
Not impose tariffs. It feels like that's a war that we cannot and probably would not win in that situation. Be regrettable. And it looks like we're towards the back of the queue for the tariffs, which is a good thing. But I don't feel in this situation with someone like him, retaliation is going to work longer term.
And if, however, he were to extend what he's planning to do to our giant service industry, that would be a problem, wouldn't it?
That would be more of a game changer, given the nature of the UK economy and the nature of our export markets. Let's hope not.
Andy, there's so much more to talk to you about, so don't go away. More from Scaramucci on Trump and much more from Andy Haldane in just a minute or two.
OK, so welcome to the break, hashtag Peston. So here we go. This is drag and drop. This is Screeny. And basically, I want you to chart things along here. How likely are they to happen? So let's start with Prince Harry. How likely is Donald Trump to deport him?
Okay, so I have that at 5%.
5%? OK.
Yeah, so how do you do that?
Right over there.
Okay.
You can do it yourself. Yeah, take it if you want.
This way?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it. Pull it across.
How do I get over here?
It's amazing. OK,
Okay.
so you don't think he's
Yeah,
into
that's
that?
not going to happen. He's not going to happen.
OK.
Doesn't want to
What's the
upset
chance of him
monarchy.
coming to the UK and visiting Clacton with its local MP, Nigel Farage?
Visiting Clapton, like Eric Clapton? The singer?
Clacton.
Oh, Clacton. I'm sorry. Jesus.
Nigel Farage is an
Yeah.
MP for Clacton in Essex.
Yeah, it's not.
How do you think
not
their relationship
unlikely.
is right now?
I think he likes him, and so I'm going to put that at 60.
Oh,
I think-
60?
Yeah, that's
Oh, okay.
Yep.
That's quite high.
Yeah. I think.
Oh, do you wanna do it? Go for it.
I think that his base in. So where do I put that? Like over here.
60's like here,
Oh,
I
it's over
reckon.
there.
Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think he likes. I think he
All
likes
right.
him, and I think his base likes him.
Forces through another term.
Yeah,
Becomes
we're
the
gonna have that.
48th
We're going to put that
president of the United
behind
States.
Harry over here.
Oh,
It's
you
gonna
think no
go-
chance?
Yeah, we're going to go over here with that. Oh,
That's off the chart.
okay, we're over here.
Who will it
Yeah.
be then?
Okay, we're over here with that one. Okay, I just want to make sure we're over here. That's not going to happen. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Elon Musk, they fall out.
Yeah,
Fireworks.
No.
Really?
So no, not going to happen. So I can't put it over there. He's going to be over here with that. He's
Okay, so it's
going
not
to be-
impossible.
This will be a fizzling out, not a fallout.
Okay,
he's
but it will fizzle out.
He's too powerful and too dangerous for Donald Trump, and so Trump is too politically astute to do anything too damaging to Musk. Okay, go ahead.
Keir Starmer and Trump hold hands, like he once did with Theresa May.
Theresa May? Yeah, I'm going to put that over by the 48. He's not going to hold Keir Starmer's hand.
Okay.
He's,
Take that off the screen, but just tell me, do you think they'll get on? Do you think Keir Starmer will ever stand up to Trump?
What does he have to stand up to Trump for?
Gaza.
Well, he's made a statement. He said that he was...
He disagrees.
Again, he disagrees. He's made a statement. I would just recommend that the Prime Minister stay out of the guy's field of vision. You don't need to be overly engaging this person. Let your staff engage him. He'll want to denigrate you because that's his nature.
Take him out of the field of vision, along with the
out of the field of vision.
That's it.
Why get in this guy's field of vision when you don't need to?
Exactly.
Let people like me do it, okay? We're not politicians.
Do it for him. Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Andy Haldane is still with me. Andy, for pretty much all of the last 15 years, you and I have been talking about how to get the growth rate up in this country. You were positive about the way that she changed her so-called fiscal rules to encourage investment, but then we had this big growth speech last week. The centrepiece of it was trying to bring back progress towards a third runway at Heathrow, developing an Oxford-Cambridge super cluster, joining up these two knowledge powerhouses. In the round, what did you take from last week's set of announcements? That it good symbolism, or do you think it will actually have a major impact on the growth rate?
Better tone, which is good. For perking up those animal spirits, and the projects you mentioned are definitely directionally right. Will they move the dial on growth today or tomorrow? Probably not. It felt a bit, Robert, like a sort of end of election term speech rather than a beginning of a term speech. You know, at the end, towards an election, when you're running out of ideas, those Treasury officials push their shopping trolley around Whitehall departments looking for ideas. And it felt a bit shopping list-like rather than growth plan. Maybe that will come. There wasn't much, if you live, you know, west of Oxford or north of Nottingham, there's not much to show, actually. And the truth is, the government will not meet its national mission unless we get growth going locally everywhere across the UK.
Because you're right. I mean, one of the things that Keir Starmer did say, which he didn't have to say, I mean, because he made a completely pointless commitment to getting living standards up in the course of the Parliament, because there's never been a Parliament where living standards didn't rise, even if by a minuscule amount, even in the last one. But he also said it would rise in every single bit of the country, which is slightly harder to achieve, I think.
Harder to achieve, but necessary to achieve that national mission, I think. And that's why the local growth plans that are currently cooking are important and need backing with money as well as words.
And just to be clear, we're likely, I think, to see interest rates cut tomorrow. So two things. One is, do you think they will cut tomorrow? And B, right now, what is more important? What you might call easier monetary conditions, bringing interest rates down, or more structural reforms from the government that give us a chance over the longer term of really getting more prosperous?
Yeah, I mean, it's a racing certainty, I think, that rates will be cut tomorrow. I would say overdue. Borrowing costs, I think, have been a bit too high for a bit too long, given that the inflation genie's largely back in the bottle.
Yeah.
And the economy is on unsteady legs. It's traversing sideways. So cheaper borrowing costs alongside the extra fiscal stimulus this year will hopefully make for a somewhat perkier growth picture than last year.
But that's not a long-term change. That's just a cyclical thing.
That's right.
Now, I've bowled you the easy deliveries. There's now going to be some slightly tougher stuff from Anushka.
Come over to the screen. Very, very excited to have a proper geek, an economics geek here at the screen with me. And Andy, what I want to talk to you about is a domestic headache that you were touching on there, facing Rachel Reeves, who we have here. I just want to take you through a few different charts. Now, headroom is something we often discuss here on Peston. Now, under Rachel Reeves' own fiscal rules, the OBR said she had only 9.9 billion. And we'll come to that in a second, but do you think she's still got it? Or do you agree with those who say it's disappeared?
I mean, bond yields have round-tripped. They've picked up, they've gone back down again. Growth prospects, I'm not sure much has changed since the last OBR forecast. I'm not sure that headroom has yet gone.
Right.
But equally, it is diddy, isn't it?
I mean, it's diddy as it is. Even with nearly 10 billion, look at it historically, it's really tiny. And just to put that in context, I want to show you this. So let me just explain this to you. It shows you from the Institute for Fiscal Studies how volatile our economy is. It highlights that by starting here in the middle with an OBR forecast for borrowing. And then we get events. And events year by year change the borrowing forecast. They either make them worse or they make them better. So this is around potentially austerity, making things much worse than that line. Here you go. We might say that's Brexit with a bit of brightening up in between. You might disagree, Steve. A longer conversation for another time. You know, look, as we go down here, this is the impact that COVID had on the borrowing, forecast. The forecast started here. It was way worse by the end of the period. And this looks like the Ukraine war, perhaps Liz Truss's mini budget. Now, Ben Zaranko from the IFS tells me that headroom that we just had a look at, this is a percentage here of GDP. It's around here. Sorry, very bad line, but 0.3%. Now, we'll talk about her fiscal rules that demand that headroom, but looking at it, has Rachel Reeves left herself enough space?
No, and nor have her predecessors, to be absolutely clear. I mean, all the reds here, they are a part, I think, of the OBR having consistently overestimated growth for quite a long time. They would say there's less chance of that now, having revised down their forecast, but nonetheless, the margins are mammoth, are they not?
OK, and we talk about growth. We might be waiting a while for it. Robert thinks we might not be here when Heathrow actually happens, if Heathrow happens.
I mean, dead. We'll be dead. It's never going to happen.
He thinks it's never going to happen. So as we're waiting for the growth, there are a number of options left to Rachel Reeves. These two are not very nice. She can cut spending, she can raise taxes, or she could chuck the fiscal rules in the bin and increase borrowing. I wonder, Andy, what would you do?
Well, given where the economy is, that fragility, I think the first two will be making a bad situation worse right now.
Right.
I think there'll be a lot of reluctance to change the rules again.
But you would do that?
I wouldn't. I would build more margin in, actually, than is the case right now. We've got a hair trigger on our fiscal rules right now. Build in some margin.
How do you do that?
We can say that if it's plus or minus 10 billion, 20 billion, you let it fly.
So what, you have your rules, but with a lot of slack?
So we have for monetary policy, right? We have a 2% inflation target with a margin of plus or minus 1%. Right. Why not have that for fiscal as well, given how much uncertainty?
Because this will be painful.
This is the wrong time. This will make a bad situation worse to those animal spirits that get the economy going.
OK, Andy, thank you very much for coming to the screen. I think if you join the others over there...
So you heard it there. That was, I think, a bit of really constructive economics. We're ignoring a small erosion, a small disappearance of headroom, which must be the rational thing to do. Far be it from me to agree with Andy Haldane. Now, the thing we haven't talked about today, which is unusual for this programme, is the potential short to medium term boost to growth if we are able to improve the terms of trade with the European Union. One of the things that the European Union have been talking to us about as a sort of precondition of all of this is to allow a few more of their students over here for a period on a sort of exchange programme. Now, it is quite striking to me that I think, Steve, you're in favour of this. I mean, the Home Secretary, in a supposedly pro-EU government, thinks it's a disaster, this free movement of students scheme, but you think it's a good idea?
Just as I made that apology to Ireland, talked about humility on their interest, resolve on our own, and I was able to do it because I was a Brexiteer. But similarly, on the young people moving to and fro, as long as it's time limited, as long as they're not here forever, as long as they come and go back, as long as there's a cap on numbers, I'm all in favour. It would be a gesture of goodwill. It would be a blip in the inflation numbers, but not a huge one compared to the other figures. And I'm afraid this is one where you've got to be a Brexiteer to say it's a good idea, because otherwise people are outdoing one another to be Brexiteer than Nigel Farage, and it's a disaster.
And apparently, most of the British public agree with you. Isn't that right, Anushka?
Yeah, here we go. Here is a poll on it from YouGov. 67% of people either strongly support or tend to support the idea of a youth mobility scheme. And interestingly, among Tories, there is more support than opposition to it.
Well, they'd like their young people to go and do some work in Europe for a while. And I go sailing famously at a place where the supply of young people from the UK was closed off. But actually, they had a record year using a supply of young people teaching sailing from across Europe. But, you know, these things can be coped with. But I'm all in favour of it as a gesture of goodwill that would change the tone.
And Emily, why are Keir and Yvette so terrified of signing up to this youth mobility scheme?
I don't think it's been handled very well by the Europeans. I mean, they raised...
It's all the Europeans' fault. That makes the change.
Let me just say, right, first of all, they raise it in the middle of a general election. I mean, have they never seen a British general election? Do they expect to get a serious answer in the middle of all of that, right? So that was the first thing. Secondly, what's all this about preconditions? I thought we weren't allowed to cherry pick. You know, I mean, when we ask for something, it's cherry picking. When they ask for something, it's preconditions.
You're sounding like Boris Johnson.
I'm not sounding like Boris Johnson. I'm sounding like somebody who's in the middle of negotiations. And frankly, you know, let's see what comes out of it. I mean, people are very relaxed about New Zealanders and Australians, you know, coming over to the UK for a short period of time, and our youngsters going over there. I don't think anybody's going to die in a ditch on it, but...
Well, they are dying in a ditch in it at the moment. Your government is dying in a ditch on it.
They've blown it.
They have not blown it. They are in the middle of negotiations, and I don't think it's terribly helpful negotiating on the Peston show, with all respect. I think it's up to people going over and arguing. There's a number of things. I mean, the French also say, as a precondition, that we have to agree to let them have even more fish before we're even going to be in a defence agreement with them. I mean, like, you know, people need to get real on this. They need to be able to discuss these things and not have preconditions and actually discuss things in a grown-up way. And I don't think... my being on this programme and necessarily telling you what I think is necessarily going to help.
Well, I think we've got to go back to Remainer Steve, because he's desperate to come in.
I've had so much to do with the EU over the time that's on the record and off the record. This was supposed to be the routine 5-year review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. If you look at where the EU started the positioning, they said there were going to be no big changes, and that we were going to stick within the framework we have. And I know privately they want to stick within the framework we've got. They don't want a big change because they've talked enough about the UK and Northern Ireland. And the only...
because you left out service economy
I didn't...
from your agreement.
Well, I'd love to have not. So the only way to have played this negotiation was to play it all down. We're not expecting any big changes. And then quietly in the background, slip in all the sensible things which got left out as very minor incremental measures that we all don't need to make a fuss about. Because as soon as you make a fuss about it, you end up with this immense war of words, and that's the mistake, and that's how he's playing.
I've got to bring in The Economist at this point. So... you know, at the moment, I'm afraid most investors in the UK don't see anything happening that is going to massively increase the underlying growth rate. If we could reasonably significantly prove to investors that the costs of trading with the EU had reduced significantly, is that, you know, the sort of more significant thing that this government could do to improve investor optimism about the potential growth rate here?
It's among the things that could be done. I don't think it's just EU-specific, though, Robert. You know, if the industrial strategy gets legs, that will mean we are better able to sell more stuff to everyone around the world. And that's what brings in international investors.
It's not the terms of trade with the EU, it's improving the competitiveness here, which should be the starting point, or both.
It's both. It's both. And it's ultimately having more businesses, you know, whose goods are both cheap enough and of high enough quality to sell around the world. That is the name of the game.
But you can't deliver on an economic strategy in less than 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right? It's not. We cannot. That's not going to happen by next year, right?
It's not. It doesn't need to, though. It's not about destination. It's about direction of travel and commitment to course. That's what brings in international investors for the long term.
Now, look, unfortunately, although it's going to be more from all of you in a minute or two, I do have to go to our sponsors, as it were. Andy, you've been a joy to see, as always. Thanks very much for joining us. And there'll be more from Anthony Scaramucci and Steve and Emily in just a minute or two.
Hello, welcome to the break. Given that local elections have been pushed back so far, we've tangentially linked it to timelines. This is what this is about. I want you to give me some timelines about when things might happen. So, number one, when might we get a deal with over the Chagos Islands?
It's already been sold out.
Done.
I think he's already done it. I think it's a disaster. I think it's too expensive and terrible strategically.
How much is it going to cost?
Well, isn't it 18 billion now?
Emily's like looking up to the sky.
If you priced it, in a week, we're sending 350 million pounds a week.
Is this difficult for the government? Difficult attack?
It's a negotiation that's had to straddle 2 elections. That's been the problem. Well, 3 elections: the British election, the Mauritian election, and the American election. So it's kind of got a bit tangled up. Can I say, just a quick plug? I think it's also really importantly about fish. It's one of the most pristine areas in the oceans of the world, untouched, and we need to make sure that that's part of the deal, and it's a really important part of the deal. And we see some of the most outstanding natural resources
Did you
there.
say
that
fish?
Just need to, yeah, the fish.
Oh.
The fish. No one talks about
No
the
one
fish.
talks about the fish.
No one talks about the fish.
It's a long way to go fishing.
No one goes fishing.
There
Just
was
leave
never
it.
been about created
It's
this echo.
exactly,
this
exactly,
important-
and we just
Okay,
don't want it
all right.
wrecked.
Just leave it
Andy,
and do nothing.
Runway at Heathrow. Do you agree with Robert, or do you think you'll see it?
Robert was never, right?
Robert's
Yeah,
never.
never.
I think it's going to happen.
Really?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Oh, well, we'll talk about it later.
When do you think? What's the timeline on it?
Well, I mean, what's the current racing bet? 2035? Is that about right?
2035.
off.
What do you two think? Emily, you
I
don't
think
look convinced.
2035, if at all. I think that 10 years is a very long time in politics and might mean never.
Emily, do you think these colleagues of yours who are still not back in the party will be back in?
No.
Yes,
You think so? Do you think he'll be fighting the next election?
yes.
Steve, do you think Kemi Badenoch will make the next election?
Yes, she's going to do a fantastic job.
How long do you think she's going to be in that position?
I think that she's going to find a way to pull the stops out, win the next election and be Prime Minister.
And finally, one-word answer from all of you. Will there be a youth mobility scheme?
Yes.
Yes, and should be.
Ish.
Ish.
Welcome back. Now, we've done a slightly unusual thing in breaking up my conversation with Anthony Scaramucci. He's the former aide to Donald Trump, the American president. Now, in the second part of my interview, I asked him why Donald Trump, in public at least, is being really quite nice and polite about our Prime Minister Keir Starmer, even though, let's say, their policies and values don't seem terribly aligned to me.
Well, it's interesting. You know, Prime Minister Starmer said some negative things about the Gaza situation, which I'm sure he felt compelled to do. So we'll have to see how Trump reacts to that. But I think I said that Trump likes this country. He's familiar with this country. His mother was from Scotland. He loves the British monarchy. He loved the Queen. The pomp and circumstance associated with his state visit a few years back, I think, was very well played by Queen Elizabeth. And
so, just to be clear, you don't think he would want to jeopardise a second state visit, I'm assuming? He wants another one here.
I think he wants another state visit, and I think he recognizes that there's no sweat off of his back to have a good relationship with the UK government. And so even though Keir Starmer is like a Labour leader and Trump is a supposed conservative, but he's honestly isn't, and we don't really know what he is, he doesn't want to have a difficult relationship here.
Now, I am going to ask you something I know that, you have been for a long time really interested in. This crypto coin that he's launched, it looks like an absolute scandal. I mean, in this country, that would be seen as blatant corruption by a prime minister.
You guys are arguing over Taylor Swift tickets over here, right? I think the prime minister got some free Taylor Swift tickets a few months back or something like that. That seemed to be a big scandal. This guy took $500 million out of the market 48 hours before he was sworn in to the most powerful leadership position in the world. And so there's no outrage. I think...
why is there no outrage? Because also this is a mechanism by which, if I want to bribe him, I just buy his coin.
Yeah, just send him your wallet address, give him a call, and you can buy it probably from his treasury over time. And I think we're normalizing this behavior. We have sitting senators. I mean, I'm sitting here with you telling you the truth about what he's doing, but we don't have sitting senators willing to do that.
It's incredible.
We have sitting senators that will call people like me and ask me for a donation, and then they'll say to me, hey, I really dislike Donald Trump. And then they'll do every single thing that Donald Trump wants, and then you call them and say, well, what is it? Do you dislike him? Or you don't? Well, I don't want to die on that hill. There may be something more significant. I certainly don't want to be primary by an alt-right person that would replace me like they did to Liz Cheney up in Wyoming. So listen, it's a tough situation, but totally resolvable. Most bullies are resolved by a group of people getting together and stopping the bully. But it feels like that most of the people in Washington fear him, and they fear his political power, and they want to stay in power. They won't fight him.
And then we're almost out of time. I've got to ask you one other question, because you talked about fear and the fact that most senators, most Republicans seem terrified of him. But do you think he fears Musk? Is he strong enough ever to turn on Musk?
I think that relationship with Fizzle, I think he does fear Musk. I think Trump is a politically astute person. He's a formidable politician. He's just experienced the greatest political comeback in U.S. history that was aided by the richest man in the world. Somebody that dumped over $250 million of U.S. dollars into the race and organized the strategy in Pennsylvania to help him win Pennsylvania. And he has a $44 billion megaphone that Trump has used successfully to win the 2 out of 3 presidential elections. And so, to me, I do think he fears him. And I think he's told aides that are close to him that Elon will get bored and this thing will fizzle out, just give it a little bit of time. He doesn't like the distraction of Elon Musk. He doesn't like the attention that Elon Musk is getting. But I don't think he's going to go after Elon Musk. I think it's too dangerous and perilous. And I would say both sides feel that way.
Yeah.
Musk certainly doesn't want to be in an antagonistic relationship with him. Many of his businesses are tied to the U.S. government.
Anthony Scaramucci, as always, it's been an enormous pleasure to have you here.
It's good to be here, and I understand you have really good political asylum laws here, so I'm happy to be here to make my
I'll be on the phone to Downing Street to sort you out.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, I did want to move the conversation on
He's a charmer, isn't he?
He's very
what a
charming.
charmer.
He's a charming and very amusing bloke. And I wanted to move the conversation on a bit, just actually to pick up what we were talking about at the end, which is the extraordinary power of Elon Musk. He's had, whether, we like it or not, he has shaken things up, even in the UK, with some of the things he's said on his own platform, where the algorithm massively promotes anything that he says. At least in the case of Trump, he was democratically elected, right? But even Trump, basically has to kowtow to Musk, right? How do democratic leaders cope with such a wealthy and powerful individual?
So I think there's 2 things. The first thing I'd say was, before hearing that, I thought it's not going to last. In fact, it won't last more than 6 months. I'll give it 6 months because Trump doesn't want anyone to be a bigger personality than him and getting more attention than him. But I hear the arguments around it, and I think that's it is interesting, the idea that Trump is starting to say, but I can't really do anything about it. I hope he will just lose interest. I think that in the UK, there's a number of things. I think also in the EU, there's a number of things. So I've been to France recently and to Brussels, and they're working on a legal case against Elon Musk about whether or not he's abusing his algorithm, not just to promote himself, but to promote far right. And of course, word goes round that, Elon Musk is perhaps the first person to have been radicalised by his own platform, because he just sees this far right stuff again and again and becomes, and I think rather than, because we're doing an inquiry in my select committee into disinformation, and the difficulty is, do you do a value judgment on, I don't like that post, I don't like that, I don't think that's true, or do you look at how is it that this information is appearing in front of people, and then you go behind that and think, why is that information being used and put in front of people? And of course, we have not only non-state actors like Elon Musk who jump up and down and say, I want to do this, but you have state actors as well who don't necessarily out about it, but are also promoting disinformation and undermining democracies.
And Steve, just to be clear on this, I mean, part of his influence is through X, and part of these potentates' influence is through social media. But to be clear, when you've got $450 billion and you can give, tens and tens of millions of dollars and not even notice it to a presidential campaign, your power goes way beyond social media.
Well, yeah, and it's a very, very good reason why the USA should have reform of campaign finance. I mean, a US senator, if people do the arithmetic, a US senator has to raise about every day the amount that we would be allowed to spend in a general election campaign. I mean, the sums of money involved in the US are absolutely vast, and there's a really strong case for campaign finance reform. But the broader point I'd make is power corrupts. And I think when you're fighting in politics, you've got to be really careful how you win and the price you pay along the way to win. And I think that Donald Trump might find he's paid too great a price to win with the support of Elon Musk.
I mean, so much more I need to talk to you about, but I do want to go to Anushka first.
Just really want to show you a couple of things that are happening tonight. This is the New York Times. Trump officials try to walk back Gaza, basically suggesting that it would be temporary, no US troops involved. And just very quickly, this tweet that President Trump has signed an order prohibiting transgender women and girls from competing in women's sports. So going on doing more of what he has warned he will.
Right, we've got almost no time. Just capture how you feel about the first few days of Trump. You've got 2 sentences each, or at most.
OK, first of all, it's exhausting. And secondly, you have to hold on to reality and go, does he mean it? Should we be responding right now? Keep breathing.
Steve.
He's going to offend vast swathes of people by going through them like a bowling ball, but he's going to achieve some things worth achieving.
All right, well, you're going to have to come back and point those out to us when you've seen them. Right, that is it. You've got to admit that Series 2 of Trump on Top, I suppose that's one way of calling it, is more thrills and spills than the first one. If your nerves can stand it, join us again next week. It's going to be a rollercoaster. Goodbye.